I've been using my new Outfeed assembly table now for a couple of weeks, and as good as the original design is, it didn't take long before I realized it could benefit from a few tweaks. Like getting rid of this rocking due to the uneven concrete floor and leveling it out so that the top of the table is coplanar with the top of the table saw. I also need to route some reliefs into the top to give somewhere for miter bars to go when I'm making crosscuts. And it needs wheels, because everything should be on wheels. And then there's the matter of work holding. I designed this table with the use of F-style clamps in mind. I can clamp virtually anywhere around the perimeter with F-style clamps, but being able to have stopping and/or clamps at different locations on the top would be really beneficial, as well as some ways to make securing long and awkwardly sized materials a little bit more manageable. So today I want to walk you guys through how I solved a few of these issues in hopes that maybe it'll give you some ideas on how to improve your workspace as well. For leveling and maneuverability, I'm going to use these Workbench casters and leveling feet that I picked up from Rockler. The leveling feet are pretty straightforward. Flip the table over, align them to where you want to install them, drill some pilot holes, and then screw them down. The Workbench casters are straightforward as well, but the screws that they come with are a bit too long for my 3/4 inch thick legs. I opted to put a block of plywood behind the legs to catch the unused portion of the screw. I believe the instructions call for the screws to be 2 inches and 4 3/4 inches from the bottom of the leg. I use this cabinet hardware jig from True Precision Tools to drill my pilot holes. This jig lets me lock in the location of the holes both up and down and left and right all in one shot, and then use it again on the other 3 legs without having to do any measuring or layout. Once the pilot holes are drilled, I can attach the caster brackets to the leg, followed by installing the actual caster to the bracket, and then clean up my mess from where I accidentally used too much wax on the threads of the screws. Before flipping the table back over, I routed a 1/4 inch groove 1 inch deep and 1/2 inch back on the top front stretcher. This groove will be for my, let's just call it, interesting take on a sliding deadman. And if you don't know what a sliding deadman is, well, keep watching. Since the router can only cut so far once it runs into the leg, I chiseled the rest out by hand. This was a completely spur-of-the-moment idea, otherwise I would have milled this up before assembling the table to begin with. With the table upright again, I could focus on making the reliefs for the miter gauge slots. There's a narrow area for the miter bar and a wider area for the little tab that's usually on the front of a miter bar. So I made sure to pull my measurements referencing the wider slot so that I had plenty of room to work with. To determine how long to make the reliefs, I drove each one of my current sleds and miter gauge on the cut path and then measured how far out the longest one stuck out. I made a template to cut the 1 inch by 10 inch reliefs out of some scrap hardwood and CA glue, and then I set the plunge depth on my router directly using that template and the miter slot on the actual table saw. Then, using a 1/4 inch spiral bit and a 3/8 inch guide bushing, I routed the reliefs into the tabletop. Since the router bit leaves round corners, I left the jig fixed to the table and used it as a guide to square up the corners with the chisel. Then I moved the table back to where it would normally live, leveled it out, and tested out the miter reliefs to make sure everything lined up straight. Now I could shift my focus back to working on the sliding deadman that I talked about earlier. I started by making the track that it will slide on out of a scrap piece of ash, the same material that the bench is made out of. I want the holes to be evenly spaced, and each hole has to be drilled with 2 different sized drill bits. A narrower drill bit for the screw shank and a wider hole to countersink the head. This drill press jig that I made up helps me locate all the holes equidistant from the center and ensures that both diameter drill bits will land in the exact same spot. Once the countersunk holes were all drilled, I ripped the top twice at 45 degrees, one on each side, and then ripped a sliver off the top to take away the sharp edge. Then I could rip the whole thing once more, with the cutoff being the track. I checked to make sure that the track looked right and then it would fit, and then I took a measurement for the height of the sliding deadman. To make the sliding deadman, I started by making 2 45-degree crosscuts on what would be the bottom end of this 4-inch wide board. This V-groove will match the track that I just made and allow it to slide back and forth. I marked where the bottom of the upper stretcher would land, and then I hogged away all but just a little shy of a 1/4 inch material from that mark on the front side of it. The roughly 1/4 inch left over is what's going to ride in that 1/4 inch groove that I previously routed in the upper stretcher. Now again, I had never made one of these before, but I thought I had a pretty good idea of how they worked. I knew it should be able to be removable, but I had a hard time figuring out how exactly to install it or remove it to begin with. I kept nibbling away at the overall length and then test fitting and going back and forth, and I wasn't getting anywhere. And then, just before cutting away way too much material and ruining the whole piece, it dawned on me that I needed to actually cut the shoulder back down in order to make it work. I also drilled a series of holes through the sliding deadman with a 3/4 inch Forstner bit. To prevent tear out on the back side of the workpiece, I drilled one side almost all the way through, just enough for the point of the Forstner bit to poke through the other side, and then I flipped the piece over and used that little hole as a pilot hole to finish the cut. Then I routed a small chamfer on all the holes on the front and the back side. I hesitated to install the track originally until I knew that this whole thing was going to work, but now is when I would go ahead and install it. I used a self-centering drill bit to locate the pilot holes and then secured it down with wood screws. The sliding deadman did work as intended, but it was a bit tipsy now, probably due to all the material I kept nibbling away. So I got creative and cut the top edge at a 5-degree angle and then made a mating wedge to accompany it. With the sliding deadman experiment behind me, I could address the work stopping and clamping issues on the tabletop. I first ran masking tape around the whole perimeter of the tabletop and then marked out every 4 inches along the edges, making sure to pull from the same starting points. Those marks would be my reference marks to lay out a grid of tape to lay out where I wanted to drill dog holes. And I know someone will ask why I didn't just mark directly on the table and I wasted so much tape. The answer is actually pretty simple. One, it's a gray top, so pencil won't show up very well, meaning I'd have to use pen, which is permanent. And two, I wanted to have a bailout option in case I chickened out on this and I decided not to do it. The tape is basically cheap insurance in case I change my mind. At any rate, I didn't chicken out, and after laying out every 4 inches by 4 inches, I drilled holes at every one of the crosshairs that I just made with a 1/2 inch brad point bit. These holes didn't need to be absolutely precise with the location, but they needed to be pretty close and relatively straight up and down. And that's because to get my actual 3/4 inch dog holes, I'm going to use a router and a template. The template will be made from this piece of 5/8 inch thick melamine, cut to exactly 12 inches wide. To keep me as precise as possible, I use a marking gauge to mark 4 inches from either side of it, and use a thin steel rule and a knife to measure 4 inches on center. Then I used a fine point punch to make small divots where each one of the crosshairs were. The divots are to locate the 7/8 inch Forstner bit that I would use to drill all my holes at the drill press, using the same drill most of the way through and then flip it over and repeat method that I used earlier. I chose to use a 1/4 inch compression bit, which is an upcut and a downcut bit in one, and a 3/8 inch template bearing to route my holes. That combination with the 7/8 inch holes in the template will leave me with perfectly plumb and round 3/4 inch dog holes. I clamped a stop to the front of the bench to keep the jig still in one direction, then flushed up the end by hand and clamped the whole jig down to the table, and then I started routing. When it was time to reposition the jig, I used 4, 8, and 16 inch spacers to locate where it needed to land. This lets me move the jig over to the next set of rows without having to measure or lay out anything. On the second half of the table, I used the same method, only using a straight edge in combination with the edge instead of just using the edge of the table like I did on the first half. Then I could come back and put a slight chamfer on each hole, just like I did the sliding deadman. I actually flipped the tabletop over and put a slightly larger chamfer on the underside. This will clean up a lot of the tear out that was caused by the brad point bit and make it a bit easier to get the tabletop clamps in and out of the dog holes. Speaking of clamps, I thought it could be useful to have these sliding dovetail clamps in the front legs to assist with awkward clamping situations and to sort of work like a removable vise. I set up to route a 1/2 inch wide by 3/8 inch deep groove in the center of the leg for the clamp to enter and exit. I clamp a stop block to the end of the jig, then used a spacer and another stop block to determine exactly where my router would start and stop. then routed a 4-inch long groove using a parallel edge guide on the router. Now these clamps normally have to be inserted from the end of a piece of material, but routing this groove lets you get around that. The clamps work as a sliding dovetail, so I'll route the dovetail groove next, swapping out the straight bit for this dovetail bit, but leaving the parallel edge guide in the same place on the router so that the dovetail slot is centered in the exact same location as the first groove that I made. I really wanted to be able to use these Bessey ratcheting table clamps in there too, but they don't work with the dovetail alone. After some trial and error, I found that routing a T-slot in the dovetail at just the right height would let me use both clamps in the same groove. It's possible that some of the dovetail structural integrity is lost by routing the T-slot, but only time will tell. So I want to give you guys sort of a quick overview on what these improvements meant for me and my workbench and my workspace based on how I work. First of all, leveling feet, it's a no-brainer. We can lift this table up off the floor and get it to match up with the tabletop on the saw. That's super important. If it's too low, we have material diving off as it comes off the back of the saw. If it's too high, obviously we're going to be bumping into the lip of the table as we exit the saw blade. I have this almost perfectly coplanar with the saw. It's at the same level, but it's lowered just a little less than a 1/16 of an inch. And that's just to make sure that nothing is going to grab the edge of that table as it comes off. The wheels. Obviously, wheels make things mobile, and that's good for everyone. This bench, once in a while, will need to be on wheels and turned this way to catch longer stock as it comes off the back of the saw. That being said, it now is mobile and I can do that. Also, if I need to get a car in here, I can completely move the table out of the way. Wheels are self-explanatory. They make life a heck of a lot easier, and these seem to do the job just fine. Obviously, we needed to route the reliefs in the tabletop because that way the miter bars can get through with the table now being elevated. Other than that, for those small improvements, they make a big difference, but they're very easy to do. It doesn't take a lot of time, and once you do them, they're just done. As far as the front, we'll go ahead and talk about some of the more complicated stuff. The sliding deadman. This was an interesting experiment. I'm glad that I took on the challenge. Is it 100% necessary? Probably not, but what is? Because there's always a workaround. One thing that I like it for is for work holding. It's to give me an extra set of hands. So we take our wedge out of here and we slide this all the way down. Because we routed these holes in here, I can now put 3/4 inch dogs in here. This is a plastic dog. I picked up a pack of, I think, 8 of them for under $10. They're just plastic. They're about a 1/2 inch tall, but they're 3/4 inch at the stem. And I put a little piece of tape on here just to fill the gap a little bit because they do end up being just a little bit loose. But if I bring this up here like this and I drop him in there and I slide my wedge in and I lock this down, I now have a way to support longer stock when I need to clamp this. So I simply set it on that dog just like that, and that holds that end for me comfortably so that I can do whatever I need on this side. Of course, we have our slots here. We just slide our clamp into that groove, tighten it down. This isn't going anywhere. Obviously, I can pull it this way if I'm not careful. And if I was planing this edge and I get to that end and may want to lift, it's easy enough just to throw a clamp here and clamp it in place. So that alone makes this really just worth it, in my opinion. And obviously, because we routed both grooves, I'm still getting used to the right way to use these, but quick clamps work as well. That wasn't any quicker because I screwed the whole operation up. Like I say, I'm still getting used to these, but it makes disassembly that much quicker and easier as well. Just like this. The only issue I have with the sliding deadman is that because I screwed it up when I did the part up here with the shoulder, you know, if you wiggle it around too much, it can loosen up the wedge. Another thing, like I said, with work holding, let's drop this down to down here. We'll tighten up that wedge. Say this is a big heavy maple board, same thing. I now have a rest to rest it down on so that I can clamp this, and now I can work up here from this edge. So for me, that works really well. And on that note, I also wanted to say, a lot of times you want to mark out the end of a board. This seems kind of silly, but I like the fact that I can just set this on here and I can kind of, draw and do what I need to do, and I can get the material up at eye level instead of coming down to it. Obviously, this is a short version to make it make more sense. Let's put this guy in here. Okay, and now I have this here and I can do what I need to do to it. So that's kind of nice. I could also put it here and obviously down here with the help of a clamp as well. The way I work, that's beneficial to me. It may not be to you, but the way I kind of work and the flow and the things that I like to do, that's pretty beneficial. Let's take a look at the top and we'll talk about these dog holes up here. There's a lot of times when I want to use the hand plane really quickly just to service the edge of something. So this just came off the saw. Maybe it has a little bit of blade marks in it and I want to just get rid of those real quick. Could be a trim piece, could be that I want a really nice glue up. I can take one of these dogs now, just drop it in here just like this, and very quickly take shaving off of here. So that works out really well as a planing stop. Previously, what I would do is I would take a board here and I would clamp it with 2 F-style clamps to the edge of this and use that as a stop. Still doable, works just fine. This is obviously way quicker and way easier just being able to have this stop on here. They're a little bit slick because they are plastic, but I took some of them and I put some 220 grit sandpaper on here just to provide a little bit of friction. So I drop this guy in here. These are the slick ones. Okay, they move around a little bit. Pretty slick. We take those out and swap them out for these. It takes a little more effort to get that to move, and sometimes that's all the difference in the world. What I like now with these stops is that I now can have something hanging off the edge here, but I don't have to clamp it down, and the force can go this way. One of those things, and I know this doesn't apply to everybody, but a biscuit joiner or a domino or a doweling jig where you need to apply pressure towards the back of the table there. I can apply pressure here and I know that that board is not gonna move because of these stops. So it's so silly. It's something super simple, but it makes a big difference when you're talking about being more productive in your shop. The dog holes are not perfect because they're not done with a CNC. I did them to the best of my ability with the resources I have. So they're all perfectly the same size. They're all perfectly up and down plumb, but they're not all 100% perfectly in line with each other. And what that means is you can't use this necessarily as like an MFT top where you can use it for assembling things. I think with the MFT tops, let's just say that I had this stop here. If I was to take another board and put it here, this should be 90 degrees, which this is, but it should be 90 degrees with these holes as well. Some of the holes don't line up 100% perfectly, so I don't trust it for that kind of assembly. I also don't really find myself needing to do that kind of assembly. That would be something where you wanted to clamp this board down and clamp this board down using the holes here as a reference, and I don't really see myself needing to do that. However, having the holes there does mean that I can get clamps in here. And this is one of the beautiful things about this, is that now I can clamp this board still if need be. You can go on top, and all of these clamps will work the same. Just like that. We can also go from below, and this is the thing that I think is the coolest part. If I can figure out where the hole is, if I go up here, let's see, let's find a better situation here. There we go. We can poke it up through here. I can drop it onto here, and now I can clamp it from underneath. It's a little more cumbersome, and the idea here though is that this now provides clearance, because now I don't have this tall clamp sticking up here. I can go from underneath and put clearance here. If you clamp down real tight, the bar will leave a mark in the material, so you might want to put a scrap piece underneath there or something like that, but it works really well. So I've tried it with a few different things. When I use the router up here with the edge guide, the edge guide will clear it, where if you have this sticking up, it's not going to be able to clear. I don't know about tracks and all that other stuff because I don't have a lot of those other things, but as far as that goes, it works really, really well. So now I can clamp anywhere down on here that I want. I mean, I feel like it's up to your imagination what combination of interesting different things you can come up with for work holding when it comes to a setup like this. Anyways, hopefully that gave you guys some ideas. I know that it probably ran on a little longer than some of you might think, but a lot of good little pieces of info in here. That's all I got for you guys today. Thanks so much for watching as always, and we'll see you guys in the next video.